Picture this. You're standing in a room full of everyone you've ever loved, celebrating 50 years of marriage, when your husband of 5 decades picks up the microphone and announces he's leaving you for a 28-year-old waitress named Candy. Yes, you heard that right, Candy at our anniversary party. In front of our children, grandchildren, and every friend we'd ever made. That's exactly what happened to me 3 months ago. But here's the thing about us grandmothers. We didn't survive everything life threw at us just to be discarded by men who think we're disposable. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, and don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 at the end. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Let me tell you a little about myself. I'm Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, though everyone calls me Maggie. I've lived in the same small town in Ohio for my entire life, raised 3 children who are now in their 40s, and have 7 grandchildren who are the light of my life. I spent 45 years working as a secretary at the local courthouse, so I know a thing or two about legal documents, public records, and how this town really operates behind closed doors. My husband Robert, or Bobby as I called him, was the kind of man who seemed perfect on paper. Star quarterback in high school, served honorably in Vietnam, worked his way up to branch manager at the regional bank. We met at a church social when I was just 19, and he swept me off my feet with his charm and promises of a fairy tale life. For 50 years, I believed in those promises. I kept his house spotless, raised his children while he worked late, supported his career ambitions, and stood by his side through thick and thin. I thought we had the kind of love story you read about in books. We weathered his midlife crisis in the 90s, supported each other through the loss of our parents, and celebrated every milestone together. Sure, he'd been a little distant lately, claiming stress from the bank's recent restructuring, but I figured that was normal for a man his age facing retirement. I was so focused on planning our anniversary celebration that I completely missed the signs that my entire world was about to crumble. The planning for our 50th anniversary celebration started 6 months in advance. I wanted everything to be perfect. We rented the community center, the same place where we'd held our wedding reception 50 years earlier. I spent weeks coordinating with our children, Sarah, Michael, and David, to make sure all the grandchildren could attend. I ordered a 3-tier cake that was an exact replica of our wedding cake, complete with the same little bride and groom figurines we'd saved all these years.
I even convinced Bobby to renew our vows as part of the celebration. It'll be romantic, I told him, showing him the simple white dress I'd bought for the occasion. We can show the kids what real love looks like. He seemed hesitant at first, which I attributed to his usual discomfort with being the center of attention, but eventually agreed.
The guest list grew to over 100 people, family, old friends, neighbors, even some of Bobby's colleagues from the bank. I hand-addressed every invitation, made sure the photographer knew to capture every special moment, and even hired the same band that had played at our wedding reception. Looking back, I realized I was planning a celebration for a marriage that was already over in his mind. The day of the anniversary arrived, and everything seemed perfect. The weather was beautiful, the decorations looked stunning, and seeing 3 generations of our family together in one room filled my heart with joy. Our youngest granddaughter, Emma, who's only 5, looked absolutely precious in the little flower girl dress I'd bought her. She kept running up to me asking when Grandpa was going to dance with me like in the old movie. Bobby seemed nervous throughout the day, which I chalked up to his usual social anxiety. He kept checking his phone and excusing himself to take calls, claiming it was bank business that couldn't wait. I should have known something was wrong when he barely touched his dinner and kept avoiding eye contact with me during the speeches. Our children had each prepared beautiful tributes to our marriage. Sarah spoke about how we'd shown her what partnership looked like. Michael joked about all the times we'd embarrassed them with our public displays of affection, and David shared the marriage advice we'd given him before his own wedding. The whole room was wiping away tears, and I felt so proud of the family we'd built together. Then came time for Bobby's speech. I was expecting something romantic, maybe a little emotional. Instead, he stood up, tapped his wine glass, and cleared his throat in that way that always meant he was about to say something serious. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice shaking slightly. 50 years is a long time, and Maggie she's been a good wife and mother. The way he said it, with such finality, should have been my first clue. But I need to be honest with all of you about something. The room went completely silent. I could feel my stomach starting to twist, but I told myself he was probably just going to announce his retirement or maybe surprise me with a cruise. Instead, what came out of his mouth changed everything. "I've fallen in love with someone else," he said, not looking at me, but staring somewhere over the heads of our guests. "Her name is Candy, and I've asked her to marry me. I'll be moving out next week." For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sound was the soft jazz music still playing in the background. I honestly thought I'd misheard him. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not like this. Not after 50 years. Then the whispers started. I could hear fragments. Did he just say, at their anniversary party? Poor Maggie. Our daughter, Sarah, stood up so fast her chair fell backward. Dad, what are you talking about? I'm sorry, Sarah. I know this isn't the time or place, but I couldn't keep living a lie. He finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Complete indifference. Maggie, you deserve better than a man who isn't in love with you anymore. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. Every eye in that room was on me, watching my reaction, waiting to see the proud Margaret Hartwell crumble in front of everyone she'd ever cared about. Our grandchildren were confused, asking their parents what Grandpa meant. Emma started crying because everyone else looked upset. But here's what Bobby didn't expect. I didn't crumble. Not on the outside, anyway. 50 years of being a banker's wife had taught me how to maintain composure in social situations, no matter what was happening behind the scenes. I stood up slowly, smoothed down my white dress, and looked him directly in the eye. Well, Bobby, I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my world was ending. I suppose congratulations are in order. I picked up my wine glass and raised it slightly. To new beginnings then. The party ended quickly after that. People didn't know whether to congratulate us or console me. Family members were whispering angrily in corners while others tried to comfort the grandchildren. Bobby had the audacity to seem relieved, as if he'd just gotten some terrible burden off his chest. As I watched my guest file out, offering awkward condolences and promises to call soon, something crystallized inside me. This wasn't just about a cheating husband. This was about a man who had waited until our anniversary, our celebration of 50 years together, to humiliate me in the most public way possible. He could have asked for a divorce quietly. He could have had the decency to tell me privately first. Instead, he chose to destroy me in front of everyone I loved. That's when I decided they had messed with the wrong grandmother. I started with the bank. Not directly, mind you. I was much too smart for that. Instead, I began having quiet conversations with the wives of Bobby's colleagues. You'd be amazed how much men tell their wives about work problems when they think it's harmless gossip. Oh, Margaret, I had no idea about Bobby's situation, said Patricia Williamson, whose husband Frank worked under Bobby at the bank. Frank mentioned that Bobby's been asking some unusual questions about early retirement packages lately, and there was something about him inquiring about transferring some of his accounts to other branches. Perfect. Bobby was already making moves to protect himself, which meant he was vulnerable to having those moves scrutinized by the people who mattered, his superiors at the bank. Has Frank noticed anything else unusual? I asked innocently. Patricia lowered her voice. Well, Frank did mention that Bobby's expense reports have been substantial lately, more than usual for client entertainment. And there was some confusion about a banking conference Bobby attended last month. Frank couldn't find any record of the bank actually sending anyone to a conference that weekend. I filed away this information carefully. Bobby's lies were starting to unravel even without my direct intervention. Meanwhile, I'd been having regular coffee dates with the other ladies from church where I played the role of the dignified, heartbroken wife who was trying to understand how things went so wrong. These women had known me for decades, had seen me support Bobby through every challenge and celebrate every success. Their outrage on my behalf was genuine and powerful. 50 years, Margaret. 50 years, and he announces it at your anniversary party. Mrs. Henderson from the church auxiliary was practically vibrating with indignation. My Harold may snore like a freight train, but at least he has the decency to be faithful. I just don't understand how I missed the signs, I said, playing the confused wife perfectly. Were there things I should have noticed? Cunning men like Bobby are experts at deception, said Mrs. Patterson, whose own husband had strayed 20 years earlier before being firmly brought back into line. But mark my words, behavior like this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There will be financial irregularities, lies about where he's been, changes in his routine. Have you looked at your bank statements lately? Word was spreading through our social circles like wildfire, and not in the way Bobby had probably hoped. Instead of people accepting his amicable separation narrative, they were seeing him for what he was, a man who'd humiliated his devoted wife in the cruelest way possible. But I wasn't content to just let gossip do the work. I wanted Bobby to understand that his actions had consequences beyond his personal happiness. The opportunity came when I learned from Janet at the bank that Bobby had scheduled a meeting with the regional directors for the following week. Apparently, he wanted to discuss adjusting his position due to personal circumstances. Translation: he wanted to make sure his affair and divorce wouldn't impact his career prospects. That's when I made my first direct move. I called the bank's regional headquarters and asked to speak with the director of human resources. Hello, this is Margaret Hartwell, Robert Hartwell's wife. I believe you may want to be aware of some concerning financial irregularities before your meeting with him next week. The HR director, a woman named Ms. Chen, was immediately attentive. Banks take financial irregularities very seriously, especially when they involve management-level employees. What kind of irregularities are we talking about, Mrs. Hartwell? Well, I've been reviewing our personal finances in preparation for our divorce proceedings, and I've discovered some discrepancies. Charges on our joint credit cards for expenses that Bobby claimed were business-related, but that I know were personal. Hotel stays during times when he told me he was at banking conferences, but when I checked with the conference organizers, they had no record of him attending. I didn't make accusations. I didn't need to. I simply provided them with dates and suggested they might want to review his expense reports and personal transaction records. I mentioned that I discovered some discrepancies in our personal finances that might indicate a pattern of mixing business and personal expenses. I want to be clear, I said carefully. I'm not making any accusations of wrongdoing. I'm simply concerned that there might be some confusion about what constitutes legitimate business expenses versus personal expense. I thought the bank should be aware before any discussions about Bobby's future position. Ms. Chen thanked me for the information and assured me that the bank would look into the matter thoroughly. Within 2 days, Bobby received a call requesting that he bring all his expense documentation to the meeting for a routine audit. I knew this because Sarah still lived nearby, and Bobby, in his panic, had called her asking if she knew any good attorneys who specialized in employment issues. He sounded terrified. Mom, Sarah reported to me that evening. He kept asking if I thought the bank could actually fire him over minor expense reporting errors. I told him I didn't know, but that maybe he should have thought about that before he decided to humiliate you in public. But the bank audit was just the beginning. While Bobby was scrambling to justify his expense reports, I was implementing phase 3 of my plan: social and financial isolation. See, Bobby had built his entire life around his reputation. In our small town, he was Robert Hartwell, the successful banker, the reliable family man, the pillar of the community. That reputation was his most valuable asset, and it was also his greatest vulnerability. I started by quietly withdrawing from the joint social activities that had defined our life together, the country club membership that was in both our names. I called and explained that due to our separation, Bobby would need to establish his own membership if he wanted to continue using the facilities. The cost, it turned out, was $15,000 for a new membership, plus monthly dues well beyond what a man facing potential unemployment could afford. The charitable organizations where we'd been major donors, I contacted them personally to explain that my contributions would continue, but that Bobby's involvement was ending due to our divorce. Since most of our charitable giving had actually come from my inheritance and investments, this meant Bobby's name would be quietly removed from donor lists and board positions. Even the church, where Bobby had served as a deacon for 15 years, began to distance itself from him. Not officially, of course. Churches don't like to get involved in marital disputes. But when word spread about how he'd announced his affair at our anniversary party, people started treating him differently. The pastor's wife mentioned to me that they were praying for our family during this difficult time. But I noticed that Bobby was no longer being asked to read scripture or help with church events. The beautiful thing about small-town social dynamics is that once your reputation starts to crumble, it creates a cascading effect. People who might have remained neutral begin to choose sides, and they invariably choose the side that makes them look better by association. But what happened next made them realize their biggest mistake. That night, after the last guest had left and I'd thrown away the remains of our anniversary cake, I sat in my kitchen staring at the wall of family photos that suddenly felt like evidence of a lie. 50 years of Christmases, graduations, vacations, and quiet Sunday mornings. Had any of it been real to him? The tears came then, hot and angry. I cried for the naive 19-year-old girl who believed in fairy tales. I cried for all those years I'd packed his lunches, ironed his shirts, and defended his bad moods to the children. I cried for the retirement we'd planned, the cruise to Alaska we'd booked for next month, and the grandchildren who now had to watch their family fall apart. But you know what? After about an hour of crying, something else took over. Rage. Pure crystalline rage that burned away the self-pity and left something much more dangerous in its place. Clarity. See, Bobby made a critical error in judgment. He thought because I was 74 and had been a good wife for 50 years, that I was some helpless old woman who would just quietly accept whatever scraps he threw my way. He forgot that the same woman who'd raised 3 strong children, managed a household budget through recessions, and dealt with difficult people at the courthouse for decades wasn't going to just roll over and die because he decided to trade me in for a newer model. I made myself a cup of tea, the good china, because why save it for special occasions anymore? And started thinking like the strategic woman I'd always been, but had hidden behind the mask of the dutiful wife. Bobby wanted to play games, fun, but he was about to learn that he'd just challenged someone who'd been watching, listening, and taking mental notes for 74 years. The first thing I did was call my daughter Sarah. She was still furious about what had happened and immediately offered to handle her father. Mom, this is insane. He can't just throw away 50 years like this. And doing it at your anniversary party, that's sick. Sarah, honey, I said calmly, your father has made his choice. Now I'm going to make mine. What do you mean? I mean, your father thinks he's dealing with some helpless old woman who's going to quietly fade away. He's about to discover he's very wrong about that. I could hear the shift in Sarah's voice from protective daughter to curious observer. Mom, what are you planning? Nothing illegal, sweetheart. Nothing immoral. But I'm going to make sure that every choice your father has made comes with its appropriate consequences. After I hung up with Sarah, I sat there in my kitchen until 3 in the morning making lists. Not revenge fantasies, strategic plans. I'd learned long ago that emotional reactions rarely produce lasting results. But careful planning, that's how you change lives. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I got dressed up. Not the comfortable clothes I usually wore around the house, but my good navy suit, the one I'd worn to court hearings back in my working days. I styled my hair, put on lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. Margaret Eleanor Hartwell was back in business. My first stop was the bank, where Bobby worked. Now, you have to understand, I wasn't just the branch manager's wife. I'd been part of that community for decades. I knew every employee, had attended their weddings, baby showers, and retirement parties. More importantly, I knew their secrets, their family situations, and who could be trusted with sensitive information. Mrs. Hartwell, exclaimed Janet, the head teller who'd worked there for 20 years. I heard about, well, I'm so sorry about everything. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when it involves someone as prominent as Bobby. I could see the mixture of sympathy and curiosity in Janet's eyes, and I knew exactly how to play it.
Oh, Janet, thank you for your concern, I said, with just the right amount of dignified sadness. It's been quite a shock, as you can imagine. 50 years, and I find out he's been, well, I suppose these things happen.
Janet leaned closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Mrs. Hartwell, between you and me, we've all been wondering about those long lunch breaks he's been taking and the phone calls he takes in private. Some of us suspected something wasn't right. Bingo! I'd suspected as much, but confirmation was even better. Oh my, I said, acting surprised. I had no idea people had noticed. How embarrassing. Don't you be embarrassed about anything, Janet said firmly. You've been nothing but gracious and kind to everyone here. It's him who should be ashamed. Do you know that just last month he asked me to process some unusual expense reimbursements? Dinners at places I know you don't go to, hotel charges for nights when he told us he was at banking conferences. I filed that information away carefully. I'm sure there's an explanation for everything, I said diplomatically, but Janet wasn't finished. And the jewelry purchase. He had me wire money to Hartley's jewelry store 3 weeks ago, said it was for a client appreciation gift. But $3,200 for a client gift? That seemed excessive even for the bank standards. My heart pounded, but I kept my expression neutral. $3,000 on jewelry, while he'd been telling me we needed to be more careful with our spending. I spent another 20 minutes there, not pumping anyone for information, but simply letting people talk. Amazing how much people will tell you when they think you're the victim and they want to help. By the time I left, I had a complete picture of Bobby's behavior over the past 6 months. The mysterious appointments, the personal calls, the new clothes he'd been wearing, even the expensive lunches at restaurants I'd never been to. My next stop was the courthouse. Now this was where my 45 years of experience really paid off. I knew every clerk, every filing system, and every public record available. Most importantly, I knew how to find information that wasn't exactly advertised but was perfectly legal to access if you knew the right forms to fill out. Maggie called out Patricia, who'd worked in the records office since before I retired. Honey, I heard what happened. Are you okay? I'm managing, Pat. Actually, I was hoping you could help me with something. I need to understand our financial situation now that Bobby and I will be making changes. Property records, business licenses, tax filings, court documents. It's amazing what's public information if you know where to look and which clerk owes you a favor from the old days. Within 2 hours, I had a complete picture of every asset Bobby thought I didn't know about. The lake cabin he'd bought 3 years ago for the bank's client entertainment, but had titled in his name only the investment account he'd been contributing to without telling me, funded with money from our joint savings. The life insurance policy he changed the beneficiary on just last month from me to estate, which I knew meant he planned to change it again soon. But the most interesting discovery was the loan application. Oh yes, Bobby had applied for a substantial personal loan 6 months ago. For what, you ask? A down payment on a little house across town. The same house where, according to the property records, one Candace Marie Thompson, age 28, occupation waitress, was now listed as a resident. That's when the pieces really started falling into place. This wasn't a spontaneous midlife crisis. This had been planned, calculated. He'd been setting up his exit strategy for months, making sure he'd land on his feet while leaving me with whatever scraps he felt generous enough to leave behind. But here's what Bobby didn't realize. I wasn't just a housewife. I was a housewife with 45 years of courthouse experience, 3 generations of family connections, and a network of women who'd been watching their husbands' shenanigans for decades. More importantly, I was a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain. I started making phone calls, not to lawyers, not yet, to friends, to former colleagues, to people who owed me favors from back when I'd helped their children get jobs, or smooth over their own domestic difficulties, or simply been a shoulder to cry on during their hard time. Helen, it's Maggie. I know this is unusual, but I need a favor. You remember how I helped your daughter Linda get that job at the credit union 5 years ago? Well, I'm wondering if Linda might be able to help me understand some banking procedures. Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I remember you mentioned your nephew works for the state tax office. I'm having some concerns about our tax filings, and I'd love to know if there's a way to verify that everything's been handled properly. Susan, you know I don't usually ask for things like this, but given what Bobby's put me through, I'm trying to understand our financial situation. Your husband handles insurance policies, doesn't he? I'm wondering about the proper procedures for beneficiary changes. Each call was perfectly innocent. Each request was completely reasonable. But together, they were building me an intelligence network that would have made the CIA proud. By the end of the week, I had assembled what I like to think of as my own personal army of information gatherers. See, what Bobby never understood was that while he was making business connections and playing golf with his banker buddies, I was building real relationships with the people who actually make things happen in a small town. The first phase of my plan was simple: financial reconnaissance. My friend Helen, whose daughter worked at the credit union, casually mentioned that Bobby had been making some interesting financial moves lately. Large cash withdrawals, wire transfers, and most interesting of all, he'd opened a joint account with someone named Candace Thompson just 3 weeks ago. Linda said she found it odd, Helen confided over coffee. Men his age don't usually open joint accounts with women young enough to be their granddaughters unless something unusual is going on. Meanwhile, Dorothy's nephew in the tax office confirmed something I'd suspected. Bobby had been claiming business deductions for expenses that looked awfully personal. Expensive dinners, hotel stays, even jewelry purchases, all written off as client entertainment. The IRS, it turns out, takes a very dim view of that sort of creative accounting, especially when the amounts start adding up to real money. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My granddaughter Emma's kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, happened to mention during pickup one day that she'd seen Grandpa Bobby at the Olive Garden last month with a very young woman. Emma had been confused because she thought Grandma was Grandpa's dinner friend. Mrs. Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you remember anything else about that evening? She looked uncomfortable for a moment, then leaned closer. Mrs. Hartwell, I probably shouldn't say this, but they were very affectionate. And she was wearing the most beautiful diamond bracelet I'd ever seen. My husband and I actually wondered if it was his daughter, but then we realized you only have sons. A diamond bracelet. Interesting, especially since Bobby had been claiming we needed to tighten our belts and had convinced me to postpone the kitchen renovation I'd been wanting for years. That night, I did something I hadn't done in 50 years of marriage. I went through Bobby's personal belongings. He'd moved into the guest room after his announcement, claiming he needed space to think, which gave me the perfect opportunity to conduct a thorough investigation. Hidden in his sock drawer, like some teenage boy hiding magazines, I found credit card statements for an account I'd never seen before. Dinners at expensive restaurants, purchases from Victoria's Secret, a weekend getaway at a luxury resort just 2 hours away, all during times when he'd told me he was attending banking conferences. But the most damning evidence was the receipt from Hartley's jewelry store, dated just 1 month ago. A $3,200 diamond bracelet, paid for with cash withdrawn from our joint savings account. The same savings account I'd been contributing to faithfully for 50 years, thinking it was for our retirement. There were also hotel receipts from places I'd never heard of, restaurant bills for meals that cost more than I spent on groceries in a week, and most nauseating of all, receipts from a lingerie store for items that definitely weren't my size. I photographed everything with my phone, a skill my teenage grandson had taught me, bless him, and carefully put everything back exactly where I'd found it. Then I sat down and made a detailed timeline of Bobby's deception, cross-referencing his lies with the documented evidence. The pattern that emerged was both infuriating and useful. Bobby hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been systematically stealing from our marriage to fund his fantasy life. Every banking conference was a romantic getaway. Every client dinner was a date with candy. Every emergency at work was an excuse to spend time with his girlfriend. But more importantly, I now had evidence of financial fraud that could be used not just in our divorce proceedings, but potentially in criminal court if necessary. The plan that emerged was beautiful in its simplicity. Bobby thought he could quietly divorce me, keep his assets, and ride off into the sunset with his child bride while I lived on Social Security and whatever alimony he felt generous enough to provide. He had no idea that his sweet, naive wife had been paying attention to everything for 50 years and had the resources to fight back. Phase 1 was already in motion, gathering evidence, but Phase 2 would be much more satisfying, systematic exposure. I started with the bank, not directly, mind you. I was much too smart for that. Instead, I began having quiet conversations with the wives of Bobby's colleagues. You'd be amazed how much men tell their wives about work problems when they think it's harmless gossip. "Has Frank noticed anything else unusual?" I asked innocently. Patricia lowered her voice. Well, Frank did mention that Bobby's expense reports had been substantial lately, more than usual for client entertainment. And there was some confusion about a banking conference Bobby attended last month. Frank couldn't find any record of the bank actually sending anyone to a conference that weekend. I filed away this information carefully. Bobby's lies were starting to unravel, even without my direct intervention. Meanwhile, I'd been having regular coffee dates with the other ladies from church, where I played the role of the dignified, heartbroken wife who was trying to understand how things went so wrong. These women had known me for decades, had seen me support Bobby through every challenge and celebrate every success. Their outrage on my behalf was genuine and powerful. 50 years, Margaret. 50 years and he announces it at your anniversary party? Mrs. Henderson from the church auxiliary was practically vibrating with indignation. My herald may snore like a freight train, but at least he has the decency to be faithful. I just don't understand how I missed the signs, I said, playing the confused wife perfectly. Were there things I should have noticed? Honey, men like Bobby are experts at deception, said Mrs. Patterson, whose own husband had strayed 20 years earlier before being firmly brought back into line. But mark my words, behavior like this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There will be financial irregularities, lies about where he's been, changes in his routine. Have you looked at your bank statements lately? Word was spreading through our social circles like wildfire, and not in the way Bobby had probably hoped. Instead of people accepting his amicable separation narrative, they were seeing him for what he was, a man who'd humiliated his devoted wife in the cruelest way possible. The opportunity came when I learned from Janet at the bank that Bobby had scheduled a meeting with the regional directors for the following week. Apparently, he wanted to discuss adjusting his position due to personal circumstance. Translation: he wanted to make sure his affair and divorce wouldn't impact his career prospects. That's when I made my first direct move. I called the bank's regional headquarters and asked to speak with the Director of Human Resources. Hello, this is Margaret Hartwell, Robert Hartwell's wife. I believe you may want to be aware of some concerning financial irregularities before your meeting with him next week. The HR director, a woman named Miss Chen, was immediately attentive. Banks take financial irregularities very seriously, especially when they involve management-level employees. What kind of irregularities are we talking about, Mrs. Hartwell? Well, I've been reviewing our personal finances in preparation for our divorce proceedings, and I've discovered some discrepancies. Charges on our joint credit cards for expenses that Bobby claimed were business related, but that I know were personal. Hotel stays during times when he told me he was at banking conferences, but when I checked with the conference organizers, they had no record of him attending. I didn't make accusations. I didn't need to. I simply provided them with dates and suggested they might want to review his expense reports and personal transaction records. I mentioned that I discovered some discrepancies in our personal finances that might indicate a pattern of mixing business and personal expenses. I want to be clear, I said carefully. I'm not making any accusations of wrongdoing. I'm simply concerned that there might be some confusion about what constitutes legitimate business expenses versus personal expenses. I thought the bank should be aware before any discussions about Bobby's future position. Ms. Chen thanked me for the information and assured me that the bank would look into the matter thoroughly. Within 2 days, Bobby received a call requesting that he bring all his expense documentation to the meeting for a routine audit. I knew this because Sarah still lived nearby, and Bobby, in his panic, had called her asking if she knew any good attorneys who specialized in employment issues. He sounded terrified, Mom, Sarah reported to me that evening. He kept asking if I thought the bank could actually fire him over minor expense reporting errors. I told him I didn't know, but that maybe he should have thought about that before he decided to humiliate you in public. See, Bobby had built his entire life around his reputation in our small town. He was Robert Hartwell, the successful banker, the reliable family man, the pillar of the community. That reputation was his most valuable asset, and it was also his greatest vulnerability. I started by quietly withdrawing from the joint social activities that had defined our life together, the country club membership that was in both our names. I called and explained that due to our separation, Bobby would need to establish his own membership if he wanted to continue using the facilities. The cost, it turned out, was $15,000 for a new membership, plus monthly dues, well beyond what a man facing potential unemployment could afford. The charitable organizations where we'd been major donors, I contacted them personally to explain that my contributions would continue, but that Bobby's involvement was ending due to our divorce. Since most of our charitable giving had actually come from my inheritance and investments, this meant Bobby's name would be quietly removed from donor lists and board positions. Even the church, where Bobby had served as a deacon for 15 years, began to distance itself from him. Not officially, of course. Churches don't like to get involved in marital disputes. But when word spread about how he'd announced his affair at our anniversary party, people started treating him differently. The pastor's wife mentioned to me that they were praying for our family during this difficult time, but I noticed that Bobby was no longer being asked to read scripture or help with church events. The beautiful thing about small-town social dynamics is that once your reputation starts to crumble, it creates a cascading effect. People who might have remained neutral begin to choose sides, and they invariably choose the side that makes them look better by association. But what happened next made them realize their biggest mistake. Bobby's routine audit at the bank turned into a 3-hour investigation that ended with him being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full review of his financial practices. It seems that my helpful suggestions about reviewing his expense reports had uncovered a pattern of questionable claims dating back several years. The diamond bracelet he'd bought for Candy, charged to his corporate credit card as client entertainment expenses, the weekend getaways, banking conference accommodations, even his lunches with her had been billed as prospective client meetings. In total, Bobby had been stealing from his employer to the tune of over $15,000, a federal crime that could have landed him in prison. But here's where my years of courthouse experience really paid off. I knew that banks hate publicity more than they hate losing money. So when Bobby's supervisor called me personally to discuss the situation, I was ready with a proposition. Mr. Patterson, I said in my most reasonable voice, I understand this is a difficult situation for everyone involved. Bobby made some very poor decisions, both personally and professionally. However, I'm sure we can find a way to resolve this that doesn't require involving law enforcement. What I proposed was elegant in its simplicity. Bobby would quietly resign, forfeit his pension and retirement benefits, and repay every penny he'd stolen with interest. In exchange, the bank wouldn't press criminal charges or make the matter public. Oh, and there was one more small condition. Any legal proceedings related to our divorce would have full access to the bank's investigation records. Mr. Patterson agreed immediately. Banks love quiet solutions to messy problems. But the bank's situation was just the tip of the iceberg. While Bobby was dealing with his employment crisis, I was systematically dismantling every other aspect of his carefully constructed life. Remember that lake cabin he bought without telling me? Well, it turns out that when you purchase property while married, even if you try to hide it, your spouse has certain legal rights. My attorney, a sharp young woman named Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in complex divorce cases, filed papers claiming my interest in the property. Since Bobby had used funds from our joint investments for the down payment, I was entitled to half the cabin's value. More importantly, Rebecca discovered that Bobby had been renting the cabin out through Airbnb for the past 2 years, generating income that he'd never reported on our joint tax returns. The IRS finds that sort of omission very interesting, especially when the unreported income totals nearly 30.
The investment account he'd been secretly funding.
Since the money had come from our joint savings, I was entitled to half of everything in it, plus damages for the deception. The life insurance policy he'd changed, that required both spouses' signatures according to the original policy terms, which meant his unilateral change was invalid. But the most satisfying part was watching Bobby try to explain to Candy why their romantic future was suddenly looking much less financially secure. When Bobby came home that evening, yes, he was still living in my house, sleeping in the guest room like some pathetic boarder. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. The cocky confidence he displayed at our anniversary party was completely gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd finally realized the magnitude of his mistakes. "Maggie, we need to talk," he said, collapsing into his favorite armchair like a deflated balloon. "Of course, Bobby, I've been wanting to discuss our new arrangement." I sat across from him, perfectly composed, and watched him squirm. "The bank, they found some irregularities in my accounts." "Oh my, that sounds serious. I hope it wasn't anything too concerning." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I could see the exact moment he realized that his sweet, naive wife wasn't quite as innocent as he'd thought. "You knew about the expenses?" "Bobby, I've known about everything for quite some time now. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" What followed was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, primarily because Bobby was finally too desperate to lie. He confessed to the affair, admitted he'd been planning his exit for months, and acknowledged that he'd been stealing from both his employer and our marriage to fund his midlife fantasy. "I can't go to prison, Maggie. I'm 72 years old. It would kill me." "Well then, I suppose you better hope I'm feeling generous." I was feeling generous. Actually, not toward Bobby. He'd burn that bridge when he humiliated me in front of my entire family. But toward myself, I was feeling generous enough to give myself exactly what I deserved after 50 years of marriage. The divorce settlement I presented to him the next day through Rebecca was a thing of beauty. I would keep the house, the car, and all our joint assets. Bobby would be responsible for all the debts, including the money he owed the bank. He could have his personal belongings and whatever was left of his savings account after he paid restitution. Most importantly, he would have no claim to any of my future inheritance, Social Security, or retirement benefits. If he wanted to start over with Candy, he'd be doing it with nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever minimum wage job he could find at his age. This is ridiculous, Maggie. You can't take everything. Watch me. The beautiful thing about small towns is that news travels fast, but karma travels even faster. Within a week of Bobby's resignation from the bank, everyone knew the real story. Not because I told anyone. I didn't need to. The truth has a way of coming out on its own when you give it the right push. Bobby's golf buddies suddenly became too busy for their weekly games. The country club, where he'd been a member for 30 years, quietly informed him that his membership fees were past due and would need to be paid in full immediately or face termination. Even his barber, started treating him with the cold politeness reserved for strangers. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source, Candy herself. It turns out that a 28-year-old waitress who'd been promised a comfortable life with a successful banker wasn't particularly thrilled to discover her sugar daddy was actually a broke, unemployed ex-convict in waiting. When Bobby had to move out of our house, my house now, officially, he couldn't afford the little love nest he'd rented for them. Instead, he had to move into a one-bedroom apartment above the pizza place where Candy worked. The romance died pretty quickly after that. My friend Helen, whose daughter managed the apartment complex, mentioned that there had been some noise complaints from Bobby's unit, loud arguments, doors slamming, and eventually the sound of a young woman packing her belongings and telling someone they were pathetic and delusional if they thought she was going to live like this. The final confrontation, according to the pizza shop owner who lived downstairs, involved Candy screaming that she didn't sign up to be a broke old man's nursemaid and that Bobby could find someone desperate enough to live in poverty with him because it wasn't going to be her. Candy left town 2 weeks later, taking with her the diamond bracelet and whatever cash she could find in Bobby's wallet. She left behind only a note that said, "Thanks for the jewelry. Find someone your own age next time." Bobby tried calling me after she left. I let it go to voicemail. "Maggie, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Can we please talk about this? I know I hurt you, but maybe we can work something out. I don't have anywhere else to go." I saved the voicemail, not out of sentimentality, but because it might come in handy if he ever tried to claim in court that our divorce was amicable. But the consequences extended far beyond Bobby's personal humiliation. Word had spread through the regional banking network about his irregularities, making him essentially unemployable in any financial institution. At 72, with no references and a reputation for theft, his job prospects were limited to entry-level positions that wouldn't pay enough to cover his basic living expenses, let alone the restitution he owed. The IRS investigation that followed was particularly thorough. When government agencies start looking into your finances, they tend to find things you'd forgotten you'd hidden. Bobby's unreported rental income, questionable deductions, and creative accounting practices resulted in penalties and back taxes that consumed what little savings he had left. Meanwhile, I was thriving. The house felt lighter without his presence. I redecorated the master bedroom, finally got that kitchen renovation I'd been wanting, and started taking the painting classes I'd always been interested in, but never had time for. My children, who'd been horrified by their father's behavior, rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected. Sarah helped me set up online banking and taught me how to manage my investments independently. Michael installed a security system and changed all the locks. David took me car shopping and helped me pick out a beautiful red convertible, the first car I'd ever chosen for myself, instead of accepting whatever Bobby thought was practical. The grandchildren adapted quickly, as children do. They still saw Bobby occasionally, usually at McDonald's or other places that fit his new budget, but they spent most of their time with me in my newly vibrant home. Emma, the 5-year-old who'd been so confused at the anniversary party, now told people that Grandma was the boss of everything and Grandpa was in trouble for being mean to Grandma. The social fallout was equally satisfying. The church ladies who'd initially offered sympathy now treated me with the respect reserved for survivors. I wasn't the pathetic abandoned wife. I was the woman who'd stood up for herself and won. They started asking my advice about their own marriage problems, their financial concerns, and their strategies for dealing with difficult men. "Margaret, how did you know to look for those financial records?" asked Mrs. Patterson during our weekly coffee meetup. "Honey, I spent 45 years watching people's worst behavior in that courthouse. I learned that men who lie about one thing usually lie about everything. You just have to know where to look." "But how did you stay so calm through everything?" "I would have been screaming and throwing things, because screaming and throwing things would have made me look like the crazy ex-wife. Strategic thinking and careful documentation made me look like the wronged party who deserved justice." Which approach do you think judges and lawyers find more convincing? Word of my successful divorce strategy spread through the network of women in our community like wildfire. I started getting phone calls from women I barely knew asking for advice about their own situations. Some were dealing with cheating husbands, others with financial deception, and a few were simply tired of being taken for granted after decades of marriage. I found myself becoming an unofficial advisor for women who wanted to protect themselves but didn't know where to start. It was satisfying work, helping other women discover that they had more power than they'd realized. 6 months after that disastrous anniversary party, I received an invitation that made me laugh out loud. The bank was throwing a retirement party for Mr. Patterson, Bobby's former boss, and they'd invited me as a valued member of the banking community family. I went wearing a stunning emerald green dress I'd bought with money from my newly independent investment account. I felt completely different from the woman who'd stood in that community center 6 months earlier, watching her marriage explode in public. I wasn't the dutiful wife trying to make everything perfect. I was Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, a woman who'd built her own life on her own terms. At the party, several of Bobby's former colleagues approached me with a mixture of admiration and wariness. They'd heard the stories, of course, and they wanted to understand how a sweet little housewife had orchestrated such a complete downfall. "Mrs. Hartwell," said Janet from the teller window, "I have to ask, did you plan all of this from the beginning?" I smiled and took a sip of my champagne. "Janet, honey, I didn't plan anything. I simply decided that if Bobby wanted to play games, he should at least play with someone in his own league. The truth is, I didn't set out to destroy Bobby's life. I set out to protect my own. Everything that happened to him was a direct consequence of his own choices and actions. I just made sure those consequences couldn't be hidden or ignored. The real victory wasn't seeing Bobby lose his job, his girlfriend, and his dignity, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy those parts. The real victory was discovering that at 74 years old, I was still capable of fighting for myself. I'd spent 50 years being what everyone else needed me to be, and it turned out that underneath all that accommodation and compromise was a woman I'd forgotten existed. These days, I volunteer at the courthouse helping other women navigate the legal system during their divorces. I've become something of an unofficial advisor for wives who suspect their husbands of financial infidelity. My experience with Bobby taught me that most men aren't nearly as clever as they think they are. They're just dealing with women who've been trained not to ask uncomfortable questions. The key, I tell these women, is to remember that you're not trying to punish him. You're trying to protect yourself. Everything else is just a natural consequence of his choices. I've helped 12 women in the past 6 months document financial fraud, uncover hidden assets, and build cases that resulted in fair divorce settlements. Word has spread so much that I'm considering starting a formal consulting business. At 74, I'm discovering entrepreneurial skills I never knew I had. Bobby still lives in that apartment above the pizza place. He found a job at a gas station where he works the night shift for $12 an hour. The irony isn't lost on me that the man who once managed millions of dollars in bank assets now spends his nights making change for people buying lottery tickets and energy drinks. I see him sometimes when I'm driving through town in my red convertible, and he always looks away quickly. I don't think it's shame. Exactly. I think it's the recognition that he gambled everything on the assumption that I was weak, and he lost spectacularly. As for Candy, I heard through the grapevine that she moved to the city and is working at an upscale restaurant there. Good for her, honestly. She was young and foolish, but she wasn't the one who broke 50 years of marriage vows. That was all Bobby. I actually feel a bit sorry for her. She thought she was getting a sugar daddy and ended up with a broke senior citizen who couldn't even afford to take her to Applebee's. The most surprising development has been my romantic life. Yes, at 74, I'm dating again. His name is George. He's a retired history professor, and I met him at the community college art classes I've been taking. He's witty, kind, financially independent, and treats me like the intelligent, capable woman I've always been but was never allowed to be with Bobby. George knows my whole story, and instead of being intimidated by what I did to Bobby, he's impressed. Any man stupid enough to betray you deserved exactly what he got, he told me on our third date. I'm just grateful he was foolish enough to set you free. We're taking things slowly. I'm in no rush to remarry or combine households. I'm enjoying my independence too much, but it's wonderful to be with someone who sees my strategic thinking as an asset rather than a threat, who encourages my consulting work rather than asking me to tone it down. My children have fully accepted George, and the grandchildren adore him. He actually listens when they talk, helps with homework, and never makes them feel like they're interrupting adult conversation. The contrast with Bobby, who always seemed annoyed by family gatherings, is striking. Last month, Emma asked me why Grandpa Bobby looks so sad all the time now. I told her that sometimes grown-ups make choices that seem fun at first but turn out to have consequences they didn't think about. She considered this seriously and then said, like when I ate all my Halloween candy at once and got a tummy ache. Exactly like that, sweetheart, except Grandpa Bobby's tummy ache is going to last much longer. The best part about this whole experience is that I'm genuinely happy now. Not the kind of happiness you have to convince yourself of, but real contentment. I wake up every morning in my beautiful house, drink my coffee from the good china, and plan my day around things I actually want to do. I travel with my girlfriends. We took a cruise to Alaska last month, the same one Bobby and I had planned before he decided to blow up our marriage. I spoil my grandchildren without having to justify every purchase to a man who spent thousands on jewelry for his girlfriend. I've redecorated the entire house in colors I actually like instead of the beige Bobby preferred because it was neutral. My advice to other women facing similar situations? Don't get mad, get strategic. Don't waste time on revenge fantasies. Focus on protecting your future. Document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that you probably have more power than you realize. Most importantly, never underestimate what you're capable of when you finally decide to fight for yourself. Bobby wanted a fresh start with a younger woman. Well, I got a fresh start too, and mine actually worked out. He's working nights at a gas station, living alone above a pizza shop, and facing years of debt and legal consequences. I'm traveling the world, dating a wonderful man, running a successful consulting practice, and surrounded by family who respect and admire me. The difference? I planned for success while he planned for fantasy. I built on strengths I developed over a lifetime while he threw away everything he built for a moment of excitement. I played the long game while he couldn't see past his immediate desire. So remember, ladies, we didn't survive everything life has thrown at us just to be thrown away by men who think we're disposable. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to disappear and building something better from the ashes of what they destroy. Thank you for listening to my story, and don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10 in the comments. Trust me, it felt even better to live through than it did to tell. And if you're facing something similar, remember, you're stronger than you know, smarter than they think, and more capable than they ever gave you credit for.